The book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. Let's spend some time with the author right now. That's Jon Meacham. He's received the Pulitzer Prize 2008 biography of Andrew Jackson, American Lion, executive editor at Random House, author of the New York Times bestsellers Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, American Gospel, and Franklin and Winston, teaches at Vanderbilt University and the University of the South. If we read many more of his resume, we wouldn't have any time to talk to him. Jon, good morning to you.
And I'm not going to tell you which sheriffs are after me, but thank you.
We'll Google that one after the interview is done. Well, what an outstanding book. You know, I haven't had a chance to dig into it, but boy, the reviews you're getting from notable people and people who are in the know on this sort of thing, just off the charts, and some really unprecedented access for you with the Bush family too, right?
It was. I had access to the president's audio diaries, which he kept as president. He dictated quite often, not every week, but pretty much every week, sometimes several times a week, his diaries as vice president. And every member of the family whom I asked to sit down and talk to did so on multiple occasions. I interviewed President Bush himself over the course, really, of 9 years. This project started in vitro, really, way back in 1998 when I first met him, and I realized that he had this kind of quiet, persistent charisma that made him a more complicated and interesting figure than I had fully appreciated when he was president.
I want to ask one question that's right up the top of my head, tip of my tongue, and that's I had a conversation last night with a friend while watching the Republican debate. And Jeb Bush had, I think, a decent night, did okay. But one of the answers, he was shaky, and I was just thinking to myself, this is the one who was supposed to be the president. We always heard, George W. Bush, he's all right. He wasn't supposed to be the next president. That was Jeb. Jeb's the great one. Jeb's the politician. Jeb's got the charisma. Jeb's got it. Is that necessarily true? Was that sort of, was he the anointed Bush to take the next presidency?
I can't use the barnyard epitaph that George H.W. Bush used, but he said it was bull, that there was never some dynastic conversation where the crown was to go to Jeb. When I talked to Governor Bush about it, I said, were you the one? And he said, well, if I were the one, nobody ever gave me the memo. I don't think it's true. And I asked, the best explanation of it I heard came from Bush 43, who acknowledged that it was part of the family legend. But he said he thinks it came from the fact that Jeb grew up, even though Jeb's younger, Jeb grew up faster than George W. did. George W. bounced around a good bit. Jeb got married early, had his babies early, got through UT in 2.5 years. George W. Bush was bouncing around some oil fields and went to Alaska to try to find himself for a while. Then, ended up at Harvard Business School, so it wasn't a crazy wander jar. And also George W. Bush, I think I'm the first to reveal that he first considered a political race in 1972 in running for a state Senate seat in Houston. He decided not to do it. But he did run for Congress in 1978. So this idea that George W. Bush was not seen as a political creature is just wrong-headed.
What are the I guess, what's the interfamily political structure? You would kind of wonder about competition between brothers, vying for time with Dad, vying for time with the people that Dad knew. Any of that sort of thing go on?
Well, I don't think so. I think that it's not, and I've spent a lot of time around him, and of course I'm an outsider, but I've spent a good many hours in different kinds of settings with them, and they talk about what families talk about. Now, admittedly, when the grandfather of the family or the father of the family will say something about, well, yeah, Francois Mitterrand just told me this, it's a little different than my Thanksgiving dinner. We had wild turkey. They had the president of Turkey. I mean, I acknowledge that this is different. But they talk about sports. They talk about the family. They're very indirect about the basic politics and policy. Unquestionably, the fundraising networks have helped. Unquestionably, when George W. was running both for governor and when Jeb was running for governor and when George W. was running for president, unquestionably, Bush 41 was a hugely important draw for fundraisers and support. But of course you would be. But it was a dad working for his son. And when the son became president, the son became president. And he would offer advice if asked, and frankly, he wasn't asked very often.
Jon Meacham with us, his book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. People, of course, know him as vice president and president. His career before, his life, I should say, really, before the national stage of politics is quite something to behold in and of itself. His service, his being envoy to China, director of the CIA. Did all of that make him a better president, or do you think it made things more challenging for him once he took office?
Oh, I think that the former. I think that these were all tributaries that formed a very powerful river that equipped him to meet the challenges of his time. Dick Cheney said very graciously recently, said it to me in an interview, and then said it publicly as well, that if you were to try to design a president for the 1989-93 period as a cyborg, you design George Herbert Walker Bush. Someone who'd been in China, so he knew when Tiananmen Square happened, he knew the players. Someone who had been vice president under Ronald Reagan and yet the UN, and so he understood the Soviet Union. Someone who had spent all these years as vice president on all these trips, also at the UN, also at China, and able to put together that 35-nation coalition to eject Saddam from Kuwait. No, to quote Tennyson, we're all a part of all that we have met. And I think that he was a better president. I think he was a consequential president because he had this remarkable resume. And for what it's worth, it's hard to imagine a president having that long a paper trail and that rich a record now. I mean, imagine that, they're going after Rubio's credit card records when he was, I don't even know what he was. I mean, can you imagine, going through every UN vote, going through every initiative in China, the director of the CIA, what happened? It's just a different climate now, and people are down on the establishment. I guess I'd argue that before you kick the establishment and dismiss it totally, Franklin Roosevelt was part of an establishment. Theodore Roosevelt was part of an establishment. George Herbert Walker Bush was part of an establishment. And they may not be the sexiest candidates, but they are, in fact, they have proven historically to be good for the country. And George Bush isn't perfect. He's not a saint. He had some terrible political blind spots, didn't do everything right, but he always tried to put the country first. And even his enemies, even his political foes say that. Barack Obama told me that. Can you imagine two more different men in American life than George Herbert Walker Bush of Kennebunkport and Greenwich and Barack Hussein Obama of Honolulu? No. No. It was a stupid rhetorical question. No, you cannot. But I interviewed President Obama for this, and he's incredibly eloquent about how important George H.W. Bush is. And so I wrote this book because I believed that this presidency, this life, really represents the last of the greatest generation, just as we were turning a historical page to the baby boomer generation taking over. And I think we've lost something. And but it's recoverable. But to recover it, we have to understand the people who embodied the older order. And it's an amazing human story, from World War II to losing a daughter to leukemia, to the oil business, to all these jobs, to Watergate, to Reagan. It's just almost hard to imagine. If I'd pitched this as a screenplay, they would have thrown me out.
We're spending some time with Jon Meacham. His book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. All right, John, a lot has been made about the hard-ass comments.
Iron ass.
Sorry, I get my asses mixed up. Is it a big deal or is it not a big deal?
It's a big deal in that he's never criticized those folks publicly before. So, yeah, I understand why it's news. He offered a criticism of his son, believing that George W. should not have used axis of evil, and that sometimes his rhetoric got too hot. George W., whom I took the comments to, said, yeah, my rhetoric could get hot, but they understood me in Midland. I think that what I wish got a little more attention is that 41 and 43 were closer on the substance of what happened during 43's administration than people have appreciated. He wrote him a letter about the Iraq invasion. He spoke to him about it. 41 endorsed 43's course. And so I think you have to take it whole. But it bothered him, clearly. He repeated these points to me several times over several years. The hawkish image, the swaggering image that the administration could have, Bush thought was not historically beneficial or diplomatically beneficial. And I think that in speaking to history, in speaking for the record, he wanted to make that point. And let me tell you one thing about George H.W. Bush. He doesn't say anything he doesn't mean. Being director of the CIA was the perfect job for him. So so he knew when he said that you and I would be talking about it.
Jon Meacham, his new book is out right now, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. We had a former speechwriter of 41 on the show with us once and asked him what he thought his biggest political regret was, George H.W. Bush. Yeah. And I believe he said, if I recall correctly, not campaigning harder for re-election. You have a whole chapter, I'm just not sure I want to run again. George H.W. Bush saying, soon we'll have to start thinking of the campaign. I dread it. Did you get anything in your talks with him about a little bit of regret that he did not campaign harder, that he did not play up his strengths more in that 92 campaign?
I got a lot of how ghastly it was. 92 was a perfect storm. He had Pat Buchanan challenge him in the primaries. He had Newt Gingrich having bolted over the budget deal. He had Ross Perot exacerbating everything. And he had a formidable opponent in Bill Clinton. And that 12-year rule, we don't like 12 years of one-party rule in the White House. Hadn't had it since Roosevelt and Truman at that point. So to some extent, George H.W. Bush was living on borrowed historical time. I think, I know, because when I said, what is your greatest regret? He says, I shouldn't have said, read my lips. Mm-hmm. He should not have made an inflexible promise about whether or not he would have to raise tax revenues to help balance the budget, which frankly is connected to your other guest. Because he broke that pledge, the right wing walked out on him. The left wing of the Democratic Party was then able to extract even more concessions from him. And that set up a series of dominoes, political dominoes, that really culminated in that crushing defeat to Bill Clinton.
You're going to want to grab this book. You're going to want to learn a whole lot more about a guy that maybe you thought you knew a whole lot about. Jon Meacham's book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush. Jon, thanks for the time this morning. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. Thanks. Great question.